For this session, we are going to be learning about a national network of response organizations that assist the arts field following a disaster. We're thrilled to present several of the people and organizations that we've been working with on disaster response following the December 2021 tornadoes and the flooding in eastern Kentucky earlier this year in July. We've got a lot to talk about, so I want to welcome our panelists. All of them are representatives of response organization that assist the arts field following disasters. We have Jan Newcomb with the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, that's abbreviated NCAPER. Tom Clareson of Performing Arts Readiness, Cameron Baxter Lewis of CERF Plus, and Elena Gregg from the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation and the National Heritage Responders. Welcome, friends. We'll start with each of our panelists giving us a quick overview of their agency and how they work in the field of arts disaster readiness, response, and recovery. And we'll start with Cameron, please.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everything look okay? Great. Well, thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I am very fortunate to work for CERF Plus, the Artist Safety Net. I want to start off by sharing an artist with you all. This is Christina Bothwell. She was a recipient of one of our emergency relief grants, and she lives in Stillwater, Pennsylvania. She unfortunately lost her entire studio to a fire, which is a very common emergency that we see. CERF Plus started 37 years ago now. I just updated that slide. And really our origin story is that there were all these craft shows, and you would always hear about an artist at the craft show who had some sort of career-threatening emergency, whether that was a really bad car accident or maybe some sort of illness or a natural or a climate-related disaster. And folks would literally pass a hat to collect money for them. Fast forward 37 years, now we are national organizations that try to serve craft artists throughout the life cycle of their career, starting with emergency readiness education, also advocating for them at the federal level to make sure that they are considered when there's FEMA policies and when there's other federal legislation for them, as well as kind of our flagship program, which is our emergency relief grant program. This is kind of a snapshot of a bunch of pictures from our emergency relief grant program. As I mentioned, it is our largest program, and we really try to be there for artists when they need us most. And that program is pretty simplistic in nature. Craft artists who have experienced a recent career-threatening emergency are eligible for a $3,000 grant. That money is given to them directly via cash or electronic bank transfer, and they're able to use those funds as they see best for their lives. And sometimes, we hear stories of them paying for very simple things like food and water, and sometimes, they use those funds to help kickstart their career or regain their career again. So it's a very, trust-based philanthropic model. I also want to very briefly mention that we have a studio protector that's on our website. It started off in this wall poster that had this cheeky "Cover Your A's" title that has folks think about different categories for readiness. And now it's a little bit more interactive. You start off by assessing your risk and then figuring out, your game plan from there. And I encourage everybody, even if you're not an artist, to check out this page. There's relevant information for all of us to consider in our readiness. And I'm also always open to feedback about ways that we could be doing this better. So that's a little bit about us. I will stop there. And I think Elena is going to be up next.
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you, and hi to fellow panelists. So I'm Elena Gregg. I'm the Emergency Programs Coordinator for the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. We are the sister organization of the American Institute for Conservation. And FAIC, we really embody conservation outreach. So within our umbrella, we have Connecting to Collections Care, the Collections Assessment for Preservation Program, or CAP program. And the two programs that I oversee are the National Heritage Responders Volunteer Corps and the Alliance for Response Initiative. So Alliance for Response, to start, that is a network-based program. We have assisted over 30 regions around the country to start networks, and they are cooperative from the start. So we bring together first responders and emergency personnel with cultural heritage caretakers in order to create a network in especially disaster-prone regions where people can work together and establish relationships before a disastrous event. The goals for Alliance for Response are to build relationships, to educate cultural heritage and emergency management professionals, and then to develop strong ongoing networks to facilitate local response. Each group, we help groups get started, and then each group kind of does their own thing. Some have created mutual aid agreements with local county officials. Some have worked to create an annex onto local response plans to include cultural heritage into a pre-existing plan. Some will provide response team training to their members. So we just try and get these people together, and then they can kind of take it from there. And then for the National Heritage Responders, they are a national volunteer corps. Everybody who is in the National Heritage Responders has been trained either through us, through FAIC, or through the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, SCRI. And everybody more or less comes into the group with some sort of experience responding to a disaster, whether that be from their own personal experience. This is especially true for people that join the group from the Gulf Coast, or who have grown up with hurricanes or wildfires or other sort of cyclic disastrous events. And they are trained to assist impacted institutions with foundational collections emergency response. So they will help institutions with prioritization of damaged objects and collections. They'll help them prioritize what to do after a disaster. They also have an emergency hotline that's operational 24/7, and it's monitored by our volunteers. I can drop that in the chat in a bit. But yeah, they're a national level group that is able to field questions and email inquiries, and they also have deployed in person as well. So those are the two groups. I think I might share my screen for just a minute to show an example of how these two groups work. Let's see. No, I said I wasn't going to do this, but I changed my mind. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, okay. So this is an institution that I worked for before joining FAIC. It's called Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. It's located in Miami, Florida. And it's, as you can see, right on the water, about 100 feet from Biscayne Bay, and just prone to every sort of disastrous event. There's hurricanes every year, not every year to Miami, but there's hurricane preparedness every year for sure. Pest activity, relative humidity concerns, and UV for sure. So in 2017, Hurricane Irma hit Miami and was quite disastrous for the region and for Vizcaya. Here's some images of damage to the northern part of the property. The entire basement was compromised. Electrical systems were located in the basement. Cafe, gift shop, all of it was quite inundated with water, and we lost many, many collections. Areas that had been restored were also impacted, and a lot of eastern-facing portions of the property were significantly impacted. So in the aftermath, we tapped these two resources through FAIC. We brought in local volunteers through the Alliance for Response that was established in South Florida. They helped us address damage in the response phase of this disaster. And then we also brought in the National Heritage Responders. So here is one of the NHR volunteers who came on site and helped us just label and document damage to the site. So this was before I started working for FAIC, and I saw, at the time, the impact of these two programs and the fact that we could get support and people to help us kind of logically go through the disaster steps in a very vulnerable time. All right, so that's it for me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Cameron, also. And I'm sorry to have missed the transition from Cameron to Elena. I had a pen running out of ink emergency I had to take care of. But now we'll move next to Tom Clareson from Performing Arts Readiness.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about PARS activities. And I'll go quickly because everybody's been good about staying on time. And there we go. I just wanted to give an idea of the organizations that are on our steering committee. We have a mixture of the leading arts organizations, whether it is in certain parts of the industry, regional arts organizations and state arts organizations, as well as conservation centers that are have for the years and years been working in the library, archive, and museum field for recovery, but are now moving on to work with the arts field as well. And we have a lot of different resources that we make available, and we have been and want to continue to make available to Kentucky organizations, outreach and community engagement like these presentations, information resources on our website that I'll talk about, Circuit Rider Project, which is actually getting people on site to work with organizations, templates and tools. We have a new tool called Arts Ready D-Plan that I'll talk about, and we have funding. I always say that this is an opportunity to talk about free resources, classes, and money, and so that's one of the things that we have available. The other thing that we have been working with are festivals, and especially outdoor festivals, how they can be affected by disasters and how they can prepare for disasters. And we work quite a bit with arts administration programs, including this is going to be our third year of working with Leah's program at University of Kentucky. We have information resources from all of those cultural heritage and performing arts leaders that I talked about who are on our steering committee, but we have worked on articles that looked at the alley theater recovery, program pivoting during COVID, and an especially interesting topic right now, succession planning in arts organizations. And CCAHA, the Conservation Center in Philadelphia, and my parent organization, Lyrasis, just got a grant to look at succession planning and how that works across libraries, archives, museums, and arts organizations. And we have regular Facebook and Twitter posts, I think much more regular than we ever thought when we set them up. We have a lot of webinars, a wide variety, and these are offered live online, and people can sign up at the time to have the instructors there to lead the discussion and answer questions, but also these are available 24/7 and are recorded. And so you can get a recording of the most recent of each of these classes that you can listen to anytime you would like to. So the other thing I mentioned was grants, and we have given grants for disaster planning, almost 90 of those. You'll see that a couple of those have been in Kentucky. Regional networks to set up networks that specifically focus on arts organizations, and in some areas, many areas actually, trying to match those with organizations that are leaders in the library, archive, and museum field, or existing AFR organizations where we can. And then finally, the Circuit Rider program, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this program provides local training, plan development consulting, assistance in regional disasters, and building of networks. And what we do is, through our grant from the Mellon Foundation, we are able to get a 0.5 FTE person to work with certain areas or organizations and provide all these services. So you can see that there are a number of areas that we've worked on already and worked in already. And certainly, potentially after the Kentucky work that Leah is doing, maybe some type of network or use of a circuit rider might be a possibility in that area as well. I mentioned D-Plan Arts Ready. We've developed an automated planning, disaster planning tool, bringing together the D-Plan tool from Northeast Document Conservation Center and Arts Ready from South Arts into one tool that can help you look at disaster risk factors and development of disaster plan components. And the biggest news for us to think about today is that for arts organizations, we're offering a 1-year subscription fee waiver if you sign up through NCAPER, Jan's organization. So that is a quick run through from my side of things, and I will jump off here and stop sharing.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. And speaking of NCAPER and Jan, we will move to her next and let her introduce herself and NCAPER.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, NCAPER. I think some of you on this call have possibly seen my face of late, since we actually hosted calls with after the Western Kentucky disaster from the tornadoes, and then just recently from the flooding in Eastern Kentucky. The National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, which we affectionately call NCAPER for obvious reasons, is a voluntary task force, really, of National Arts Service and organizations and funders. And really, we came about because there was a huge gap noticed after Katrina and Rita that FEMA really deals with, and the cultural heritage community really well, but had no interaction with artists and arts organizations. And that's really much of the, if not like 90% of the arts sector. So what happened is the Americans for the Arts and CERF Plus had a convening, and out of that, and that was in 2006, and out of that came NCAPER. And it truly is like cats on a leash. We're not a nonprofit organization, but we do live under the auspices of South Arts as our fiscal agent. And what we do is we're trying to build a coordinated nationwide safety net for our entire field, not just for the cultural heritage, which we love and work with, but they've been protected for a long time. And as we know, just recently, that's not always the same for arts organizations. So we're building alliances as we go. We advocate for preparedness and disaster support for the entire arts sector and we have publications and resources development. Some of you may have seen, we sent a lot of these arts guides, field guides to the Kentucky Arts Council after the emergencies. And really what it is in plain English, which is not all that easy to do, is to help you get to understand what could be available to you in federal disaster relief. And not only do you get a pathway for FEMA support, but also how to deal with the SBA and also 11 other federal agencies that really fund people and organizations after disasters. So it's an important guide, and all this you can find on ncaper.org. We also, as I mentioned, we facilitate post-disaster virtual convenings for artists and arts organizations in order to connect them to our NCAPER members. We have organizations such as Music Cares and Entertainment Community Fund. Those organizations all support individual performing artists of different disciplines, and they can actually get help to you right away. CERF Plus is also a member, and of course, Cameron mentioned that the support for individual craft artists is really wonderful, and that's long standing. And then of course, PAR, Performing Arts Readiness, that Tom just talked about, is also a member of NCAPER. And what we've found since we've been doing these calls is just how kind of unprepared we are in trying to reach out to the different parts of the country. So we started a crisis analysis and mitigation coaching program. And we had, in our first graduate class, we had 11 people from all over the United States who are full-time working in either a local arts agency, state, regional, or national, and it becomes part of their job. They learn how to, they go under AIR collaborative training to learn how to reach out to the entire community that they serve, and to work with that community, not only with readiness, and so you work with emergency preparedness people, artists, government people, but also to learn how to develop community-focused mitigation projects. And this is what is done. Mitigation is like Preparedness 202. It's after you've gone through a disaster. And if you live in Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, even here in upstate New York, you know it can happen again. So you take the blue skies time, which is when everybody is feeling good and you know, oh, that can't happen again. You use that time to say, what could we do better? How can we improve our readiness as a community? And so I just want to say that we're looking for another class of CAM coaches, and the deadline is the end of this week. Please go on our website, and if you're interested in this kind of work, it's really humbling and wonderful. We've had wonderful reviews, and we've had some really good action. And it's not just about handling natural disasters. There are a lot of social problems in some of these communities that our coaches come from, and they've already been working with to develop projects to help overcome some of the issues that they've been having to deal with. So that's NCAPER. We kind of, you know, our phone calls can be 5 or 6, or like after Maria in Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, we had weekly calls, then bi-weekly calls for over a year. So we're here to help and to connect and to advocate. So thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I'm going to do something really unfair, and since you just got done talking, I'm going to have you talk again, because you mentioned in your remarks blue skies syndrome, and I'd like you to explain that, because it's possible not everybody in this webinar knows what that is and why it's important. So if you would, and the other panelists should feel free to chime in as well.
Thanks, Tom. That's kind of a phrase we coined because it almost goes to the Venn diagram that Leah talked about, you know, the apathy. What happens is you start to feel better. You start to get after a disaster, you know, you're in the recovery response and then recovery phase, and you just don't want to deal with it anymore. You want to say, well, all right, you know, we know the hurricane might come again, but maybe not. Maybe it won't be as bad. So we call that the blue sky syndrome, because the blue skies are out and things are going well. And unless you incorporate what you've learned and how to deal with these lessons learned and how then your behavior should change, then you're just going to be in the infinite loop and never fully recover. And of course, as we know, 40-something% of small organizations, businesses never come back. So you don't want to be in that category.
Thank you, Jan. And we may revisit that some point later in the discussion, but I want to move to another question right now. And Elena, I'll toss this one to you. Tell us about your work in Kentucky, both with the Western Kentucky tornadoes and the flooding in Eastern Kentucky, please.
Yeah, so we base all of our work on the input we get via our emergency hotline and from our email correspondence with folks. For Western Kentucky, we did not receive calls from impacted sites or the public, but with Eastern Kentucky, we did. So with Eastern Kentucky, both myself and Rebecca Elder, she's the coordinator for the National Heritage Responders, attended the coordination calls through the Kentucky Arts Council and through NCAPER, especially at the beginning. And at this point, we've sent several shipments of PPE to the Museum of the Mountain Dulcimer. We've also been in touch with Apple Shop and Heinemann Settlement School to see about a potential in-person deployment. We are considering sending a team of volunteers to Heinemann to support recovery efforts for both those institutions and others if needed. And a deployment could include anything from training staff on how to handle damaged and sensitive materials, wet salvage considerations. They could help drying materials that have been impacted. So we're considering a whole bunch of different options at this point. But yeah, kind of to be determined. We have some of our volunteers helped Apple Shop immediately following the flood do a virtual assessment of their site. So we also have that capability where we can have, if people have access to internet, they can, jump on a FaceTime or Zoom call with us and show us what's going on, and we can weigh in virtually, or, if people send in photos, we can help prioritize and kind of guide actions from afar as well.
Thank you, Elena. Cameron, why don't you tell us about your work in Kentucky?
Sure, and I will share just 2 more slides, I promise. I want to say Kentucky Arts Council has really been amazing. Emily and Chris have connected us with many of the artists that were impacted, so I want to thank them for their outreach and their work here. This first artist, James Justin Roberts, he was impacted by tornadoes in December. And simply what happened was, because the electricity was out, the stoplights were out, and he was going across an intersection, and the other car also thought it was their turn to go across the intersection. So a pretty bad car accident as a result of that emergency. In total, for tornadoes, we awarded 5 grants to craft art. And this next story is from the flooding in July. We worked really closely with Troublesome Stringed Instrument Company, which we talked about earlier. Emily connected me with Douglas Naselroad, who's like my new mentor / guru, really fascinating person, has had an incredible life. But Doug has helped us connect with some of the luthiers that were impacted by this flooding. And we're able to award 10 emergency relief grants to those folks, as well as 4 other emergency relief grants as a result of that flooding.
All right, thank you, Cameron. Tom, why don't you share with us what Performing Arts Readiness has been doing in Kentucky?
Sure. We worked quite a bit with some of the Western Kentucky organizations that were struck by the tornadoes at the end of 2021, particularly staying in correspondence and discussion with the Ice House Gallery and Museum, and then with a number of organizations in the Paducah area, particularly thinking about the theater, festival, and arts areas there. So we continue to correspond months after, unfortunately approaching a year after the disasters there. And then on the Eastern Kentucky activities, mainly what I've been doing is working with the calls that Kentucky Arts Council and NCAPER has put together, especially trying to do some matchmaking with funders who might be able to help in certain situations. So in that case, it's more communication in the sort of wide view, but we certainly work with organizations one-on-one for as long as needed.
All right, thank you, Tom. And finally, Jan, the same question to you. If you could share with us what NCAPER has been doing in Kentucky.
Well, as I mentioned before, after each disaster, we hosted 5 or 6 phone calls each end of the state after the tornadoes and then the flooding. And because of that, as you know, both I think Cameron mentioned it, was on one of those calls that he got together with Doug, and that facilitated some things happening for individual artists. The possibly even, well, exciting to me is having worked so quickly with Emily, because we had 2 disasters in a row, and the rest of the State Arts Council. We've developed the idea of having a state activation teams, and it would involve some of the CAM coaches. Our goal is to have a coach in every state. So, we're really excited about that using Kentucky as a model of how we did all this, and trying to get that across the country so that we can get out in front of things. Otherwise, it's like if you don't know someone in the state, or you have to introduce yourself to the state arts people, it takes some time, and you want to help people as soon as they're ready for some real assistance. So that's kind of what we've done, and I'm excited about replicating that, not for the reasons, but being prepared.
All right, Elena, when you were introducing yourself a moment ago, you talked about some professional experience you had before with respect to disaster readiness and recovery. Could you tell us from your experience and perspective why readiness is important and what it entails in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. So my experience at Vizcaya was a great example of kind of before readiness is in place, and then steps that can be taken to improve your resilience the next time around. So at the time of Hurricane Irma's arrival, though there was a disaster plan in place, staff had not been trained on it in several years. And the majority of staff that were in positions such as collections-based or security or maintenance positions, the folks that had experience handling objects and, coming on site in emergency settings, had not been trained on the plan. In addition, we didn't have any concept of a disaster recovery vendor. We certainly did not have a contract in place with a vendor, or really an idea of how that process would go if we did call someone in to help us. So in the immediate aftermath, it took about 48 hours for us to figure out how to get a truck on site to remove water from the basement. The result of that was just exacerbated mold conditions throughout the main property, total loss of really all of the furniture that was in that space, as well as complete compromise of electrical systems because we didn't have a way to get water extracted. So anyway, moving on from Hurricane Irma, the institution at large really prioritized disaster planning from a funding perspective and from a training perspective. We put together a curriculum for quarterly training for all of staff, ranging from how to handle objects in an emergency environment, how to protect objects, just what our communications plan was. So what does our phone tree look like? Who is getting in touch with who? What if the power grid fails? Like, then how are we going to communicate with one another? We also had tabletop exercises, which are kind of like mock disaster scenarios that are done in a conversational setting. Those typically are done in calm, non-disaster seasons, where you can really identify gaps within your plan. So we did a lot of that. And then we also made a mitigation plan for just baseline things that we could improve throughout the property to lessen the impact of a future storm. So anything that had previously been stored in a basement was moved above ground. We received a grant to buy, it's called Tiger Dam. It's a fillable tube that can be placed around like especially a part of the property that receives flooding, and it kind of creates a barrier, but also you can release the water and it can be stored. So it's pretty versatile. So anyway, it was very eye-opening. I think, unfortunately, this is often the scenario where it takes an event to realize how much preparedness you need to avoid extensive damage, because it's hard to prove the need for funding when you haven't received a large-scale disaster that has impacted your site. So if anything, I think creating a disaster plan and then just training staff on what is in that plan, and having a way to get in touch with each other and just do baseline preparedness when you know that something is coming, or like simple actions that you can take after an event is key and will go quite a long way.
Thank you. And you answered a couple of follow-up questions that I didn't ask, which was what does it look like when an organization isn't prepared versus what it looks like when an organization is prepared. So thank you for illustrating that. Jan, in some previous Zoom calls or meetings that we've been involved with, you've talked a little bit about how you've got actual personal experience in dealing with disaster recovery. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you think readiness is important from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. Well, my community really suffered, well, the region in upstate New York, which is the Finger Lakes region. It's also part of Appalachia. So to remember, it's very rural. And in 72, Hurricane Agnes went very slowly up the Mississippi area. And well, everyone who didn't live on the hillside of town, we were under 20 feet of water at least. And my house wasn't close to the river really. We had rivers that flowed north. So what was really interesting to me, I live in Corning, New York. It's the headquarters of a corporate 100 organization. It used to be Corning Glassworks. It's now Corning Incorporated. Immediately, the company, I assigned my uncle to be in charge of getting the community back. And it was interesting how, because he was a musician and it was a huge cultural community. And of course, the Corning Museum of Glass is internationally known, and it wasn't completely underwater. They just went ahead and just took the lead. I mean, they told FEMA what to do, kind of thing, and it was for the whole community, and not just people who work for Corning. And that's important to remember, because we came about, there were parts of Market Street, which is blocks long that I was never allowed to go to as a child because it was filled with bars. And, that was what we were known for. It is now, after 2 years after the flood, was declared one of the best small towns for arts in America. And really what it was is they brought in preservation architects who were just became part of the community. And if you owned a building that had been damaged, they would help you bring it back to the way it had been in the late 1800s. So now we have 5 blocks of beautifully restored early 19th or late 19th century housing. And then they brought in artists to open studios. And so that compared to 17 miles down the road, Elmira, in New York, it's still recovering 50 years later, has never come back. And it's because they didn't have that leadership and coordination at the local level. So it was an experience that always stayed with me. And being a dancer, you always have to be prepared for anything as in your career. So I married a fighter pilot who is all about systems and checklists and things like that. So, it's really become a part of my life. And then the 9 arts organizations that I've run, I've had to deal with this disasters and crises that had I known about planning and being able to do some preparations, I think I would have handled possibly things more quickly and possibly better.
Thank you, Jan. Tom, I want to bring you in with this question. If you could share one thing for artists, arts organizations, or arts stakeholders now about disaster readiness, recovery, and response, what would it be? Some advice or an anecdote?
Actually, 2 things that I've been thinking about, so I'll cover them real quickly during today's conversation. One thing is to have an inventory of the people and an inventory of the skills that they have, as well as if you have arts materials because you're a museum, or if you have props because you are a theater that's running many productions, having an inventory of those can be really helpful. That is one of the ways that the Alley Theater in Houston was able to come back so quickly from the destruction that happened in Hurricane Harvey. And the other thing is, and almost everybody has mentioned this during the day today, but I think we now have to look, because of climate change and because of civil unrest, that the chance of disaster is higher. And it also is more widespread. I was just on Monday in the Boston area working on festival safety with the Indigenous Peoples Day celebration in Newton, Mass. And there was a counter protest of the Columbus Day celebration, and they sort of paraded around the site of the festival before the festival started. Nothing bad happened, but we needed to think about the security there. So it's not just thinking about natural disasters, but there are man-made disasters, technical disasters, and even sort of reputation and personnel-based disasters that we have to look out for. And so it's planning for that sort of wide spectrum of things.
All right. Thank you so much, Tom. Cameron, what's one piece of advice you'd like to share with artists, arts organization, or stakeholders about the importance of readiness, recovery, and response?
Yeah, and I just want to say I learned a lot from the panelists here today, so thank you all for your thoughtful answers. I've been working in disaster relief for about 15 years now, and I see this cycle that a lot of survivors go through where they're initially very relieved that they survived the emergency and that they feel a lot of love from the community or maybe from their friends reaching out, and they're kind of just in this place of relief. But very, very quickly after that, the reality sets in And I think talking to those folks a year, 2 years, or sometimes 3 years down the road, they're exhausted from the disaster and from the recovery. So, I think urging readiness and urging just avoiding that whole cycle is something that I strongly believe in. If there's some advice I could offer from my experience is that always take pictures of your home and studio before and after an emergency. So we all have smartphones here. We can walk around our house, take a few pictures, put them in an album. Then should something happen, it's always great to have that documentation available for FEMA or for insurance or for other programs. There's also 2 resources and organizations that I keep in my back pocket that I believe in and I think are wonderful. The first is Crisis Cleanup. They provide free volunteers to help folks after an emergency with whatever may have happened. Could that be tree removal or mucking and gutting home? They're an outstanding resource, and they work with the National VOAD membership network. So they're basically just a technology that coordinates the 2. But I always recommend checking out Crisis Cleanup. They have hotlines. You can call them, tell them what happened to you. And what they'll do is they'll ping you onto a map, and they have a closed membership that will go and claim that project and go out and help you. The second thing that I always recommend folks consider is the Disaster Distress Helpline, which is ran through SAMHSA. It's an opportunity to just talk about everything that's going on. It's a free service. And I think the mental health components of a disaster are often overlooked with just the logistics of rebuilding and trying to get folks back in their home. So I really do recommend always sharing the number for Disaster Distress Helpline with your network so they know that resource is available.
Thanks, Cameron. I want to circle back to blue sky syndrome because it's an interesting concept, and I'll throw this open to whoever responds first. I want to ask how artists and organizations can maintain a footing of, I guess I'll call it a footing of vigilance, while at the same time moving forward and making progress during that blue skies period. And as I said, I'll throw this open to whoever chimes in first.
I can start. I think that standardizing your approach to disaster preparedness could help relieve blue sky syndrome. So like set it and forget it. Just make a plan for when you're going to do certain things, whether that be documenting your site, taking pictures of everything, or identifying supplies that would be helpful in the event of an emergency and stocking those supplies. By putting it on the calendar and just forcing a day that's dedicated to certain activities, you kind of force yourself to keep that momentum up, even when your priorities do change to, your normal duties. That always worked for me personally, and working in this field, I think that definitely helps keep systems in place, and so that there is not that lag in momentum and activity between disasters.
I also think the D-Plan Arts Ready online tool is an excellent way to even do more than that, because I can make lists and stuff and then ignore them. But what happens is after you do the assessment, answer all the assessment questions, you have to create, or it forces you to create action items, and you need to give people tasks within your staff, and then those serve as reminders. They come up and, have you done your whatever task yet? And I think that is helpful especially for small organizations where you just are always doing so many things, and it is that constant, okay, I have to get back to it and do this. And I think that it's the same idea as you were saying, Elena, and it's just maybe a little more specific. And I like the idea of involving more than 2 or 3 people, so that everybody has skin in the game as far as what you can contribute to keep the organization healthy.
I think, Elena, you had mentioned that when you were in Florida, you had quarterly meetings or quarterly trainings and that sounds like you incorporated that into your calendar, whether there was a disaster coming or not. And it seems like if we make that part of our organization culture, that's setting up for success. We have a question in the chat from Elaine. How can we better share information about disaster resources / funding after a disaster? She says, I think the number of organizations that apply for funding are often small. So I'll throw that open to the panel.
I think that question and the one above that Emily had asked about advocating for disaster funding, I think the kind of thing that the Kentucky Arts Council is doing with the regular calls you're having with your constituents is really important. And I think the kind of thing that Leah is doing with sort of researching, studying, and documenting this is important. And I really feel like we need to start getting in front of legislators, representatives, and talking to them if we can, but also publishing about what the experiences have been. And so I think that those are some areas that we can go to. And with Elaine's question, I think Jan's calls in some of these states and some of these locations where these disasters have happened have been a way to share information about funding and just talk through and workshop some ideas on funding that have been really useful.
And you need to create a culture of preparedness in your organization. And when Tom and I speak to arts management classes, we're always saying, in your interviews, please ask your organization, the person doing your interview, does your organization have a readiness plan? And I said, of course, if you get the job, you'll be assigned to create the plan. But you really do want to have everybody thinking about it. It's climate change. It's all the changes in human-made disasters. It's on everybody's mind.
Yeah, I'll also say, oh, sorry, Cameron, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I know in terms of advocacy, both the South Florida Alliance for Response and the Savannah Heritage Emergency Response have effectively dedicated a seat within their county emergency operations center to cultural heritage preparedness. So both organizations worked with their county Office of Emergency Management over the course of several years to dedicate a seat. In Florida, it's under the emergency support function for business and industry. In Savannah, it's under the support function for natural and cultural resources. But by getting county government to acknowledge and embed cultural heritage and arts readiness into their emergency response plan, that is an avenue to get local and state resources as well. I know that it's also effective to communicate like tourism dollars or just the benefit that arts organizations and cultural heritage have to a local community in terms of like money, fiscal benefits. So that's one way too to get at least an advocacy perspective.
And I think, Elena, that's such a great point. And with Florida and Puerto Rico recently experiencing really catastrophic disasters, both of those are very tourism based, and the arts economy is a huge piece of that. So making that business case as opposed to just support the arts and culture sector is sometimes better received. I also, just two things I wanted to mention. First, I'm super excited for Leah's research. I think there are so many assumptions we make about what individuals need for their recovery or for their planning. It's sometimes just great to look at the data and figure out really what sort of programming, what sort of outreach are we doing that makes the most sense. And then secondly, when we're doing this type of planning for preparedness trainings, there used to be a time in the winter to early spring that most emergency drills and exercises would happen. Now disaster season is a lot more unpredictable. I can't even tell you if there is a wildfire season because it's year round. I don't know when tornadoes are going to happen. I don't know when earthquakes are going to happen. I think we had a drill planned in December of 2020, and then Puerto Rico went through dozens of earthquakes. So I do recommend considering a biannual training strategy just in case your schedule gets a little bit packed unexpectedly.
Thank all of you for your thoughts on that. It's an old journalistic tradition to save a really heavy question for the last. So I will throw this one out there. What is the outlook, in your opinion, for national level funding on a continuing basis for emergency services in the arts field? And I'll throw that to whoever wants to tackle that one first.
I would say that we're looking at it and we're working on it. It's been something that has been needed for years, but I think there's now some really concentrated work going on how to do this and who to ask about it. We're really looking at the sustainability of these organizations and how that can help with the sustainability of the field. But I think the next 3 to 5 years are going to be really important for getting this settled. And the work that's happening in states like Kentucky and the documentation of things that's happening in states like Kentucky can really help push for the sustainability of these activities.
I think Tom has a really great point. I think it's also up to all of us to collectively use our bargaining power to advocate for the need for these funds. In an ideal scenario, should there be some magic source of funding, the less restrictive it is, the better for everybody it can serve.
I also think there's been a huge increase in collaboration amongst the different sectors that are supporting the arts. I feel like even just a few years ago, performing arts and cultural heritage, they existed in 2 different silos. But I think through HENTIF, which is the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, and just these sort of opportunities to come together has definitely helped bring together national momentum across sectors, which is helpful.
I wanted to say one thing that as I'm speaking here, my colleagues have done a wonderful job, I guess, presenting at Grantmakers in the Arts and about this whole idea of funders and community responding at the community level. And one of the things that we brought together is Long Chu from the Houston Endowment, where he actually heard a couple of our presentations about preparedness and readiness. And then when they got after Harvey, they got all this money, raised all this money. And he said, wow, it had put the seed in his mind so that when it came around to supporting the Houston Arts Alliance, his money from the endowment created the job of, it's the only local arts agency, I think, in the United States, with Lauren Hanley is the disaster preparedness staff person. So that's how, you put the seeds out there, and hopefully you have enlightened funders who say, oh, I get it. I can make that connection. And we just have to keep sowing seeds like Johnny Appleseed, I guess, and keep advocating.
Well, I want to thank our panelists today, Elena Gregg, Jan Newcomb, Tom Clareson, and Cameron Baxter Lewis, for an enlightening discussion about emergency preparedness in the arts field. We're coming up on noon Eastern time, so that's the balance of our time. So we're gonna bid farewell to you and to our participants today who joined us. Thank you all for joining us. If it weren't for you being interested in this topic, we wouldn't have a reason for a panel. I do want to say that in the future, we're going to be continuing these conversations about arts readiness, response, and recovery. And you should be on the lookout for notifications from us via email about these opportunities to participate in Zoom meetings. And I also want to take time to plug the other webinars that we'll be hosting through the remainder of National Arts and Humanities Month. On October 19th, we're going to be presenting Kentucky Arts Council Grants and Programs, a primer. That's going to be program directors from the Kentucky Arts Council talking about the programs they manage and how you can get involved in those. On October 25th, we've got a pair of webinars, Broaden Your Public Art Landscape, Accessing Funding and Protecting Intellectual Property. And I believe a webinar on arts advocacy. So thank you again to our panelists, and thank you for those who have joined us today, and we will bid you good day.